Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen, and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror films throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the 1994 film Interview with the Vampire, starring Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Kirsten Dunst, Antonio Banderas, and directed by Neil Jordan. Let's watch the trailer.
So you want me to tell you the story of my life? I'll tell you my story. I'll tell you all of it. I'm flesh and blood, but not human. I haven't been human for 200 years.
From the novel by Anne Rice. From Neil Jordan, the director of The Crying Game.
I've come to answer your prayers. Life has no meaning anymore, does it?
His name is Lestat.
But what if I could give it back to you? Pluck out the pain and give you another life. One you could never imagine. I can see you lying on a bed of satin.
He chose one man. He gave him infinite power. Eternal life. And a daughter who would be forever young.
This is the only real evil left.
And then he took the light of day.
You're a vampire who never knew what life was until it ran out in a red gush over your lips.
I can't stand this any longer.
You made us what we are, didn't you?
God kills indiscriminately, and so shall we.
You like dying? You condemn me to hell! Monster.
One happy family.
Take her, Louis. End her suffering and yours. But do not doubt, you are a killer.
I want some more.
Interview with the Vampire.
It's been 30 years since we were introduced to Lestat and Louis and Claudia. We've got an awesome panel to chat about for the occasion. I'm going to bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Bobby Zier of Lugosi Theater.
Hi, guys.
The crypt kicker himself, Chad Hawks.
Hey, fanged and ready to go.
Ian Simmons of Kicking the Seat.
Hello.
And beaming in from Wisconsin, Jess Ader.
Hello, world.
And we're going to be chatting about Interview with the Vampire, 1994, celebrating its 30th anniversary. Thanks for coming on the show, buddy. And welcome. Wow. Okay, so we have some true vampire fans here. Bobby, of course, you are the head honcho over at Lugosi Theater, crypt kicker. Chad, you've made a career being a vampire. Let's talk really quick about kind of like how you came to this movie for the first time. Bobby, can we kick things off with you?
Sure. This was actually the first vampire movie I ever saw.
I did not know that.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah. Growing up in the early 90s, they ran this like constantly on cable. So I would be little and just playing in the living room, and it would be like constantly running over and over again. So I was it's the type of movie you could kind of go in and see bits and pieces of it, and you just like could slowly build on it. So it was my first, even before Dracula, it was my first real exposure to vampires.
Wow. That's awesome. Thank you, Bobby. Chad, how about you?
It was the book, actually. It was written I think it was published in 76.
Correct, yeah.
And somewhere in my preteens, maybe it was 13-ish, I got a hold of a copy and tore through it and then followed it up with The Vampire Lestat. And so when the film came out, I was super excited. I think I had read it maybe twice by that point. I was there opening weekend. And
what was your initial reaction to it, having been a fan of the book and this being kind of the first incarnation of it?
Get it right out. Tom Cruise, it's just such a weird fit. As if the director told both he and Pitt, like, okay, let's crank up the modeling because you're Victorian era vampires in New Orleans. So I wasn't super impressed.
Great. Yeah, we'll come back around. We'll discuss if that opinion has changed. Stay tuned, everybody. Ian, how about you?
I mean, this movie came out when I was in high school. I hadn't read the novel. I knew a lot. There was a lot of hype around this, and yeah, I thought it was kind of an okay movie, a little slow. I didn't quite get the hype, and then I tried to read the novel a few years later, and I thought it was just incredibly boring. But in preparation for this show, last month I went and I read Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. Subsequently to that, that whole experience in high school and all that, I actually read Memnoch the Devil, where Lestat ends up like hanging out with the devil, and I liked that book a lot. But I finally read Interview, went right to the source, and I really appreciate it. And then watching the film again about 2 days ago, very different experience from high school and then after reading the novels. I'm a fan of the book. I am a bigger fan of the movie now, although there are a lot of problems.
Yes. Well, how about you? What was your experience?
I thought that I would be great for this because this is actually my first time ever seeing it. Well, to be fair, I was like 9 when it came out, but it was around, and I was certainly the kind of kid who was watching those kind of movies. It just never happened, and
wow.
I think you guys can piloteer this, and I can fill in my thoughts with fresh eyes and fresh thoughts on it. I had a good time.
This will be fun. Yes, I remember going to this. I had not read the novel, but I remember reading excerpts from a vampire, Lestat, in Twilight Zone magazine back in the 80s. And I remember, like, he's a rock star. He's a rock star vampire. Like, how is this working out? Going back to the original novel, I was like, oh, okay. So it's like, watching a progression. But it's interesting that this movie took so long to make, considering, there was some real excitement about vampires, especially like in the mid 80s with Fright Night and Lost Boys. So for it to take literally, almost 2 decades to finally make it to the screen. And looking at it in kind of like perspective, I think it was Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula that may have opened the door for this one. It was kind of like we were getting a lot of modern vampires in the 80s, but like to have like a true kind of gothic vampire, we hadn't seen that in quite a while. And when Bram Stoker's Dracula was successful, I think that opened the door for this one to get made. Jess, I'm going to bounce down to you just kind of like for fun, because I'm curious to hear what your experience was coming to it. You've known that it was around for a long time, but was it just this that brought you to it, or had it been kicking around your head?
This reminded me to watch it. I did that during COVID when I was living alone during that time, and I did a bunch of movies that Deep Blue Sea being one of them. Another one that I don't know how I never saw it. Great aside. But yeah, I remember when Bram Stoker or the Coppola's Dracula came out. And I remember we watched all of it, but my dad made us leave during the sexy scene. So anyway, with the context of that, I watched that again, I don't know, last Halloween. And so it was interesting to come to this and think, well, this is 2 years after that, probably was being filmed around the same time. But yeah, it was really fun. And it definitely had a feeling of, and I'm sure we'll get into it more, where it's like, it could be from 1989 or the early 90s. There's still some of that bleed over with Christian Slater and everything. But yeah, I mean, I was a horror kid. I think, to be honest, this one felt like a little too mature for me. Whereas somehow the Coppola one still seemed more like a horror movie. Yeah, there was a lot of Brad Pitt's hair.
Brad Pitt had a lot of hair back then.
This isn't your dad's horror movie or vampire movie, particularly at the end with the convertible and the tape deck that really time-stamped it in such a way that was really fun in retrospect.
Bobby, what would you say is kind of like your initial reactions, having kind of grown up with it?
Honestly, I always loved it, and I could see why it led me to Dracula. How they explore I remember thinking, wow, it makes it seem so cool to be a vampire. And I love the rules, how they explained the coffins and how they made it seem realistic to be a vampire, like what that what the ins and outs of Day as a Vampire would be like. And I love how it is, as you were mentioning, in the 80s, it was very modern vampires, whereas this does have that more classical era. Like at one point, Brad Pitt's actually wearing a tuxedo and cape.
Yeah. This was one of those movies where Tom Cruise, is the headliner. He's the guy that's the poster boy, literally. For this one, and he kind of disappears for half the movie. The fact that Anne Rice was very vocal about the casting of Tom Cruise, and on the one hand, I understand, you got the biggest movie star in the world, why not approach him with it? And I think Tom Cruise was looking for something that would be a challenge to what he was known for, which is kind of these, cocksure guys with daddy issues. If you think of Top Gun and A Few Good Men, things like that.
Just from the first moment, even hearing of the upcoming film and hearing that Tom Cruise had been attached as Lestat, it's like, but he's Tom Cruise, period. Like, when has Kevin Costner ever been anything other than Kevin Costner?
Sure.
Same story for a younger Tom Cruise. Funny you should mention his absence in the last half of the film. That's actually where I feel it picks up. And I don't think he lost or picked up anything new from that cocksure guy you're talking about. And in that, I don't feel he really brings the psychological menace that Lestat is. He's just completely self-absorbed, and that's most of why he is a monster, is because he's lost his humanity. And there are moments that I can watch the film and really respect that there's some sort of depth to these characters, but for the most part, I feel like Kirsten Dunst, it's her movie. As a child actor, as an 11-year-old actor, she is just the powerhouse that keeps me watching. That was my disappointment, is these names are too big. And I understand that maybe it wouldn't have gone anywhere had they not been big names, but I think it hurt the film. Just
really quick, because the idea of Tom Cruise as Lestat, like, there's something about his immaturity that I think works to that character's favor, in that he is somebody who is self-absorbed, and which is similar to his characters of Maverick and, all, like, that sense of good-looking charisma. You don't have to be deep. And I don't get that there's necessarily a lot of depth to this Lestat. That's not to say that the Lestat in the book isn't deep. I think Cruise inhabits a certain kind of Lestat. It may not have been the Lestat that we were necessarily looking for, especially fans of the book, but there is something about that is Tom Cruise that you're like, oh yeah, that guy could totally be a vampire and not think twice about stepping on people and eating, using them as food, etc.
Agreed. And I should hang that caveat out there that my opinion of his role in the film is largely based on, that classic, I've read the novel.
Yeah.
I've developed my own characters in my head through the words that were presented, and this just doesn't fit. Watching it last night, I'm still disappointed, and it's a bit disconcerting, but as a time capsule and just to see everybody so young, it's enjoyable for completely different reasons.
I think Cruise is perfect in this role, and there seems to be a huge Cruise bias on at least part of this panel, and I don't share it. I think he's not. It's hard. It's easy to get the self-absorbed kind of image from some of the things he's done in public and some of the roles he's taken. But I disagree about Maverick and Top Gun. He's not a particularly deep character from what we see, but I don't think you can call him shallow either. He's confident and cocksure, but he has a right to be because he's an ace fighter pilot, right?
Sure.
In this movie, I think he's perfect as Lestat because especially having read the book last month. I mean, it's probably a recency bias, but he's cocky. He's a wannabe kind of aristocrat, but there is that kind of pompousness to him. But there's also that woundedness there are a couple of moments where Claudia especially gets some digs in at him, and he just has the mask kind of slips just for an instant, and you're like, there's something under there that Lestat from the novel, he's sort of an enigma as far as like where he came from, what does he want. I think any of the failings that Cruise's portrayal in the movie, I think that comes down to the screenplay, which is also written by Anne Rice. And the movie's only 2 hours long. It's a dense novel, and I think a lot of what we lose are the details that would have made the film version of Lestat much richer, such as he had very expensive tastes. Louis was the one who was fronting all of the money for their kind of lavish lifestyle, and Lestat had no business, or he had no interest in it besides like, whatever, you handle the money stuff, just buy me nice things. And that really comes across. I agree. I think Kirsten Dunst is phenomenal in this movie. It's disconcerting to me to read the book and realize that Claudia was supposed to be 5,
right? And
now she's, the act. They don't really say how old Claudia is supposed to be, but she's 11, and yet in the scene where we first encounter her, she's like sitting with her mom's corpse, saying like, "Mommy, wake up." I'm like, that's something that a 5-year-old would say, but it's just weird when you say, no, your mom's gray and she has sores and she hasn't moved for like 6 days. You'd leave at that point. In the scenes where we've got Cruise and Dunst and Pitt acting together, Brad Pitt is so terrible in this movie from top to bottom that it's a miracle the guy had a career. I mean, I think he's blossomed into a really fine actor in the decades since, but most of the feeling I got when watching him in this movie was, aw, I mean, he's really trying hard to get these lines out and make them, emote. But I remember when the movie came out, like I said, I was in high school. It was big among the theater kids. And I felt like because when they saw Brad Pitt on the screen, they saw something to aspire to in terms of acting caliber, and they were met with that. Yeah.
It would be interesting to see Tom Cruise doing this post Kubrick and like Magnolia. I think there might have been a little bit more of a menace but I think really for both of those actors at this point in their life, Brad Pitt, I guess California, he did the weird like to make himself grosser, but it's still like you were doing like Dorito ads or whatever, and it was a model. And I feel like on both of their sides at that point in their career, they were probably trying to break away from being the same guy all the time. So watching in that regard, I thought Tom Cruise was a lot more enjoyable to watch than like Brad Pitt. To me felt like I'm so deep I don't have to say anything. It felt like I get it. And but I was just more like snickering a lot at his stuff. And again, that's really to your point, Ian, I think it seemed more screenplay wise because it seemed like they were trying to hit a lot of deep topics. There's obviously slavery going on, and there's this lavish lifestyle, and it feels like they really zoomed through that fast. And I can see how maybe in the book that might have been more. I read up a little bit about it just beforehand, but it seems like they might have hit upon that a little bit more. But it seemed like the beginning just like went like third gear, tried to like get into all this backstory really fast, and then kind of slowed back down. And now most of it's just going back in time after they get you past this other moment in time. I didn't necessarily have any issues with it. It seems like who those people were at that time trying to do their goth film.
I think they make a great point there, Jess, that both Cruise and Brad Pitt were trying to do something different, and they had this big film to carry. And on the one hand, you got Brad Pitt, who doesn't want to be a vampire, and for that to be your main character, I think that's a tough role to pull off. Is that to just be living in this place of regret and living in this place of pain and an existence you don't want to be, and for that to be perpetuated throughout eternity. I don't know how you play that necessarily. I don't know how you play torture without seeming tortured. Like he does just seem kind of shell-shocked by the whole thing. Yes, screenplay, but also, I think it's almost an impossible task. And what would play on the page is a difficult thing to dramatically make interesting. He's kind of saddled with a tough job. And then you got Tom Cruise, who again, I think I would have liked to see Tom Cruise kind of lean into his Tom Cruisiness, because I see him kind of affecting an attitude. I see him kind of like putting on either an accent or certainly a quality of speech that wants to kind of hearken to like a more, I don't know, heightened character. And whereas Brad Pitt feels pretty modern, even back in the 1790 parts of the film, you know, he seems very much like Brad Pitt now. And so to see Tom Cruise trying to do, I mean, it feels a little disconnected. And it's almost like both of them are trying to be these characters, but not necessarily in the same movie. And I feel like it isn't until we get to Antonio Banderas that he's like, that guy knows what movie he's in. And that guy is super comfortable playing this character of Armand. You know, I am 400 years old, and I carry that weight with me. Do we get an idea as to how old Lestat is supposed to be?
I don't think they get into how old Lestat is in this one. He's sort of an enigma, like I said.
What is it that draws Lestat to Louis? You know, like I mean, I understand that he's attractive and he wants to die, and it's like that lays it out. But once you kind of like find out who Louis is, it's clear that these two are not going to be a good pairing for each other.
Well, and that's another, I think it's strange to say, I think the movie could have used another half hour or an hour to flesh these things out, because in the novel, Lestat has a taste for the finer things in life, and Louis was a very successful plantation owner, and there was a whole like family thing. He was mourning his brother who was I think studying to be a priest or something, but he had all of this wealth, and Lestat kind of targeted him as like saying, hey, if we become eternal roommates, then I'll never have to suffer again from being poor. But yeah, there's all these kind of like little details that are left out that was kind of frustrating. I was filling them in my head, I think partially because when I was reading the book, I had the visuals of these characters in my mind. So watching the movie, I'm like, wait, where was this scene? I'm like, oh no, that was only on the page. I do appreciate, and I'm going to jump ahead to the end here because I feel like the film knows what it is and has this little stinger of a sense of humor about the ridiculousness of Louis as a character for all the reasons that you kind of talked about, AC. It's hard. It's sort of the reason I had a problem with Lost in Translation. It's very hard to portray boredom on screen without that seeping out into the audience experience. But at the end, when Lestat shows up in the convertible and he starts to turn Christian Slater, he's listening to the audio of Louis from the interview that they had just conducted. And he's like, Louis, such a whiner. I've been listening to that for 200 years. I'm like, yes, this movie gets it. And I can't wait for the sequel. Oh, wait, what sequel?
Not reading the book, I'm like, oh, Brad Pitt's character, he had some loss and he's sad now. Like they just defined it really quickly. Some people died in his life that we'll just take our word they meant a lot to him, but we're not going to show them. And now he's just brooding and sad and emo because of it. But there's none of that, and there's no backstory. So it felt a little like fast paced for coming into this with fresh eyes and not really that much knowledge of it.
You finish the movie and you're like, wait, why was Lestat so attracted? The finer things point, Ian. I think they tried to encapsulate that they didn't flat out mention, but Lestat just moves in and he's got his feet on the table and he's like, it's like the roommate you didn't ask for that comes in and just won't leave. And at some point I was like, this is Louis's house. Like we haven't had a scene change or a set change. This is his manor. Had there been more of that, like character development with Louis, where we were able to see how grief-stricken he was, I think that was one of the things Lestat and the other vampires were attracted to, is his humanity and his ability to grieve and to have some kind of moral compass. And I always felt that Lestat turned him in. It was definitely a monstrous thing to do out of jealousy, much more than respect. For the companionship, sure, but he knows he's not a good companion. He knows he's a horrible non-entity, undead. Both characters are a little bit flat in that development, I think.
I think the more interesting version would be if Lestat was sort of like Al Pacino's character in Glengarry Glen Ross, where he really gets you into his web and pulls you in, and he makes that sale. Because in some ways he is like that, because once he finally gets him in, he's like, I want you to do everything I want to do and be exactly like me because I'm the best. And as soon as it doesn't go that way and he doesn't want to play his game and keep making the sale or whatever, he's really annoyed with him and would be the worst. What a nightmare.
I just want to see his first scene. He comes in and says, look, typo negative is for closers. That would be yeah, that's my dream.
Bobby, did you have something you want to throw in?
Yes. Well, first of all, it was so interesting for me is this was actually my first time ever seeing Tom Cruise in a movie.
Yeah.
So to me, like Lestat, that was like when I thought of Tom Cruise, I thought of Lestat. And talking about what you guys were saying, how he is, how he is this, a self-centered, emotionally mature character. And as a kid, I gravitated towards that because to me, he was a monster. There's this scene of him on the piano. He gets kind of zombified later. I love how he's sort of the monster vampire character. And as we were talking about Brad Pitt's performance, I'm thinking of the other reluctant vampires we know in our pop culture, like Dracula's daughter or Barnabas Collins, where both of them, they're sympathetic and they're reluctant, but they also have evil moments too. Whereas in this, it's sort of split up into two characters. You have Tom Cruise, the sort of the evil vampire, and then Brad Pitt, the reluctant vampire. Maybe they're not as fleshed out because usually both aspects are in the same performance.
At the end of the novel, Louis does go see Lestat, or towards the end, and they have that scene where Lestat's kind of like withered and dependent on. There's actually another vampire that he is sort of his servant, but he is afraid of modernity, like the loud noises of street traffic and the helicopter, and he's kind of the shriveled shell of himself. And Louis refuses to go back to him. That's comes out here, but then 10 minutes later, you get this scene where Lestat shows up in the convertible and they're speeding down the highway and he's like, I'm going to be a rock star now or whatever. I'm like, wait a second. Wait, I don't get this. There's only 5 years difference, I guess, between 88 and 93 or whenever this took place. What happened? That's a big question mark that I guess maybe they'll answer that in the sequel. We'll never see, but it was just disconcerting. I liked that they, as much as I like the whole whining, stop, shut up Louis thing in the car, that was funny, but it didn't match what we'd seen just a few minutes earlier.
Yeah, that was definitely something that came up for me was why does Lestat remain so decrepit for 100 years? Is it just that there was no recovering from, drinking the dead blood? But it feels like a lot of time has passed. And if he was able to go from being dead to, like I love what you said, Bobby, like kind of a zombie, coming back playing the piano. And he seems like he's a genuine threat in that scene before they set the place on fire. So for him to have kind of earned his way back with alligator and snake and toad blood,
the rules were shifty for sure.
So for the next 100 years, you think, okay, well, he's clearly got to work himself back to a state of normalcy. And again, to your point, Ian, like the very end where he's basically back to normal 5 years later, it's like, dude, what were you waiting for?
It's all the mental game. He just had to wake up and feel good one day.
Well, and that's Jed. I think that's the answer to AC's question, and it is in the movie. With the Teatro de Vampires in France, what Armand is talking about with the entire troupe and why he feels disconnected with them is that they refuse to change with the times. They're kind of stuck in these old, centuries old performer, tropes. And Armand, he's responding to Louis as being someone who is very much moving through time. He's a melancholy bastard, but he at least understands that time is progressing, even if he is not. And I feel like they're trying to tie that in with Lestat being kind of despondent because the only people he loved in his new dark life realized he was a monster, and they left. They flew away, or took a boat away to Europe, and so he was probably depressed. And the times are a changing, and there's all these noises outside. And in the movie, again, he's alone. In the novel, he'd kind of taken on this younger, vampire who also was kind of fed up with him and saw Louis returning as like, well, great, now I don't have to deal with him anymore. But there's some stuff that needs to get tightened up, I think, again, in a slightly longer version of the movie. We've got some time to explore these themes. They're in there, but they're so disconnected, they might as well not be.
My thought was not as intelligent, which was, how are they paying for rent? How are they living this life? So that, I'm assuming, was explained more in the book.
Their lavish lifestyle after the burning of the place. I'm kind of like, well, where's, how are you financing yourself in Europe? Like, they're traveling the world, we hear.
Well, I mean, again, Louis was a plantation owner. He had, some degree of wealth. So I imagine even though they had to like run to catch the boat and leave all their stuff behind, they probably still had money. Or they could just stow away on a boat, they live among the crates and stuff until they got to where they were going. But yeah. And as far as Lestat, the movie version doesn't make that much sense because he is kind of living alone in this apartment. It makes a bit more sense if he's got a familiar or another vampire that's able to go out and like procure him food or, get money to support themselves, even if it's not, the manner to which he's accustomed. It's just another hole. And it's really weird that Anne Rice wrote the screenplay based on the book, and she's like, yep, let's go with this.
That has to be a daunting task, to take your own work, which is it was a hefty novel, compress it down to what was the runtime on that one?
It's just over 2 hours
or something.
202.
Okay, even 2 hours is not enough to catch everything. What concessions do you make? What do you leave out? What do you shorten into a single line? What is just visual?
Along that line, it seemed like another topic. They're in San Francisco during like not the end of the AIDS epidemic. So I have to think that's some of that logic's in there. There's some like gay culture in there. They're trying to take on big topics of the time and be modern, but it's just such a short amount of time to give clarity on some of that. But I did think for its time, it seemed pertinent that they would just kind of brush upon some of those topics and put it in there in an artistic way. It's just a lot to cover with because you're also trying to cover the actual story and then also trying to put in this whole subtext that's even less clear about living in the modern world, especially San Francisco in the 80s, 90s, whatever. And so, and then there's just a lot of different things floating around, and it seems like they had a lot of good ideas. They couldn't get it all. They had to finally finish the edit.
That is another huge lacking from book to film, is the homoeroticism. She wrote this pre-76. 76 was the publishing date. A handful of years later, in the early 80s, that was when she started to publish under a pen name her eroticism. I have often wondered what her original film transcript was like, and at what point did the studios go, we can't do that, especially Cruise and Pitt. I mean, there are hints of that chemistry and that magic that just almost feel like a comedy in the film. When they float up, when he first gets changed, I think that is as close as we come to any sort of sexuality. And so instead, we just get tiny little hints. I do remember that as a kid going, ooh, this is racy.
When Tom Cruise says, I've had to listen to that for centuries, you get like almost like an old married couple kind of vibe.
Yes, the relationship is definitely there. And once again, when you get to Armand, I think Armand does have that sense of a mature relationship, or something, at least the potential thereof. But again, I think it kind of goes back to the immaturity of Lestat. Like, Lestat's like, let's be vampires together, without realizing that you're incompatible. Like, you are not built the same way. And therefore, which is where I kind of just keep going back to, like, why does Lestat stay? Like, why doesn't he just be like, okay, yeah, I made a mistake here. I need to move on and find somebody else who's a bit more like me. But I like what you had to say, Chad, the idea that like, because of the humanity is attractive, that becomes the reason you stay with somebody is because you want to change them. I want you to be the person that I thought you were going to be. And I feel like we see that playing out in that Lestat is like, come on, Louis, just come around and be the Louis that I want you to be. And again, that's a very immature mindset, which is where I'm like, I feel like Lestat is not a deep thinker, at least not in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, he's not. That's, I think, kind of true in the novel. There's much more of a psychological, like, abusive spouse kind of relationship in the book, where we get touches of it in the film, where Louis is interested in vampires and where they come from. That's why they want to go to Europe. But in the novel, Lestat plays like he's got all these secrets to vampirism, like all these things that I can show you and teach you. I'm not going to tell you now, but you got to stick with me, because one day I'm going to spill the beans. And he kind of holds this over Louis's head, and eventually Claudia too. And Claudia, you were talking about the romantic kind of sexual angle. That's one thing that I didn't remember from the movie when I first saw it, but it's definitely in the book, and it's very uncomfortable because you keep the novel keeps reminding you that Claudia is 5 years old, but she has the intelligence after she's been around for it's a long time, more than I think 30 years, like probably a century that she's with them. And her intelligence grows from being a 5-year-old to when she's born into darkness. It's almost like a preternatural evil behind those eyes. She's cunning. She's sadistic. There's a lot more going on in the page than there is in the film. But what is there is her pseudo-sexual relationship with Louis, which is weird because she is a mature soul, but she's in the body of, yes, a 5-year-old. Yeah. And they're sleeping together in the coffin, and it's all very strange. I'm glad they didn't put that on film, but I just, as the kids say, I got the ick reading the novel.
They kind of stick to the more paternal relationship in the film. I feel like they do a pretty good job in the film of showing her angst and just her eternal rage at that point, that like 3 decades ago, I was old enough to understand what you've done to me for eternity. I will never be in an adult body.
Right. And therefore never will have an adult relationship. Like all I've got is this permanent dynamic of father-daughter. Like if we put it in that paternal mindset, it's like, I will always be secondary. I cannot ever be your equal because we will never be perceived in the same way.
Yeah. I think it's cool the way they show how the vampire's body works. It's kind of trapped in amber at the age that they were turned. When she freaks out and tries to cut off all of her hair, and then she runs into the next room, slams the door, and she screams because it's all grown back. I mean, that's some really effective stuff. Like her birth scene, and it goes back to Kirsten Dunst. She's a great actress, but I mean, even at age 10 or 11 when she was doing this, her death scene when she's on the bed and kind of like panting and she's got blood running down her face, and then she dies and then pops back up and she's like, I want more. Like, wow, this is a completely different character that I'm afraid of now.
I was going to say also the relationship between her and Tom Cruise is so fascinating, because is Lestat being this very superficial character, you get a very like a narcissist vibe from Lestat.
Sure.
And Claudia as sort of like his sort of daughter is like an extension of him. Their hair is sort of like similar. He has her dressed like perfectly like him. He takes pride in her being a killer.
For sure.
Yeah, she definitely makes up for Louis' fault through
pretty much right away
version. Yeah, she is the unblinking killer that Louis refuses to be. Great dynamics there.
But it's also, I don't know if this was in the novel, but it struck me watching the film when she betrays Lestat and tricks him into drinking dead blood and slits his throat. When the blood starts pooling and making its way towards her, she says, Louis, help me. And he picks her up so that it won't get on her shoes. I'm like, you could have jumped or something. I don't know, but it was just such an odd moment of need. Like she was finally coming to grips with what she had done, and in that moment, she kind of reverted back to that little girl kind of helplessness. Like I don't know what's going on here. I'm freaking out. I do want to ask a question because we've talked about Brad Pitt's hair in this movie. It's so out of control during most of this. Yet in the San Francisco scenes where he's talking to Christian Slater, can you pull the hair like that tight back to the point? Because I'm like, he had to have had a haircut to do that. I don't care how long your ponytail is. That's wild.
Well, before we go to Brad Pitt's hair, as tempting as that is, I do just want to talk about the fact that that scene where Lestat is, quote, killed, where the throat is slashed. Back in the day, I think I thought that was a computer-generated effect. And it turns out that is actually a mechanical effect created by Stan Winston, where he dries up and becomes that desiccated version of himself. That is an actual physical effect occurring. And
wow.
If you think about the fact that Stan Winston was coming, 1993 was Jurassic Park. This is the next year. And Winston is all about going, how do we blend the VFX with my mechanical effects, with my makeup? And I feel like that is one of those things, like the teeth here always look a little kind of gnarly, but I think in an interesting way. Like they aren't like the pristine white vampire teeth that we've been used to. They're kind of like, teeth that have been used a lot and don't necessarily fit in your mouth because they don't belong in your mouth. You're a vampire, but I think there's some really cool stuff that happens, and it is that neat blending of digital and physical effects that was right there at that moment in time, where we start to see, rather than them leaning completely on digital, they're still using physical effects to really great effect, I think.
Well, that was one thing I was wondering throughout this, because the vampire makeup effects, not the crazy, the contacts and the fangs, but just the kind of the porcelain skin with the little blue veins. I kept watching to see if it was just my imagination, but it looked like the veins were kind of pulsating, or they were changing a bit as the light hit them, as the characters were breathing. Yeah. I don't know if that was digital or if it was just the way that they drew them into the face and the trick of the light to make it look like they were alive. But it was really unsettling. I've seen this movie, I think 3 times in my life, maybe not all the way through, certainly, but the bit where they dump Lestat's body in the swamp and you see the gator come down and then you see the blood water bubbling up, I initially thought that was like, okay, that's the gator eating the corpse. I was wondering, is that Lestat wrestling the gator, and is that blood belong to the gator? Because there's a lot of it.
I think that's what we're led to believe, is that Lestat's like, not today, sucker.
Yeah, later though.
Yeah, and I think it's meant to be where it's hard to tell, because Louis and Claudia, you could see why they assume, oh, it must be Lestat's blood.
Yeah,
right.
Whereas later on, he explains the blood of the alligator helped.
I think that's interesting point of this movie, though, because I think it's somewhere in between. It wants to be a higher class or more sophisticated horror movie in a way, but then it also wants to still have those moments that would be in more of a gore fest movie. And so it's an interesting blend at times where I don't know that it always works, because it seems like it's not quite sure what it wants to be. But there's a lot of fun moments like that throughout it, and a lot of great points being made. It just all is a little bit muddy.
When I was done watching it the first time, because I watched it once with the commentary with Neil Jordan, our director, and then watched it again. For years, I said that Jaws is basically a drama with a big shark in it. This feels like a drama with vampires in it. Like, absolutely, you have big vampire set pieces, but really it's about the struggle of the human existence. That's what's being put on screen, and we're seeing it through the lens of vampires. Where do we think that reluctance to take human life, where does Louis' morality come from? Because he is a character who genuinely feels trapped. He has less regard for human life when he's considering taking his own. but being given this new life, he seems to have complete respect for human life. It feels, there's a sanctity to it.
I think that's part of his flatness in a way, because he's not really a hero, but he also doesn't want to be bad.
Doesn't want to be the villain, right?
Yeah, it doesn't want to be the villain. So he's kind of floundering in this in-between gray area the whole movie. And so he's hard to relate to in many ways.
My take on Louis was he was sort of like the kind of like the moral compass of the story. Like he's not a proactive hero, but to me he was the one that he was like Zeppo Marx, and this was the Marx Brothers. Whereas he was a very he was relatable as a human, but not a lot going where all the other characters were the more colorful characters.
And Bobby, you said it earlier, narcissistic is really what Lestat is. He was unhappy in his mortal life, and then as soon as he turned, when you read the vampire Lestat, it makes Interview seem just like the 5-minute warm-up act. And you just go through his entire 400-year existence, and I don't want to say there's empathy there, but you understand why he is such a horrific, yes, scary monster, but much more psychological monster in Interview, where he does, it's just constant abuses. Like Ian said, the teasing of, like, this is one of the few pieces of control I can exert over you. You are ignorant to this. Therefore, I'm going to keep that from you because it keeps you with me. And Louis fed something that Lestat, as a narcissist, needed. He would probably never admit it in a sincere way, but when Louis wanted to leave, or when he did leave, that injured him. And I think that is why once they burn him and they hop a boat, I think he chooses to be injured for that long. And
very narcissistic of him.
Yeah.
I'm just going to century-long pity party. Yeah.
Yeah. And look at that. I'm talking about Lestat when I should be explaining Louis, but that's the power of that personality bearing on another personality. And Louis, maybe that's what he sensed, is he is going to be the perfect foil. He's going to be the perfect personality that I can control and that I can keep in constant despair.
Complete codependent relationship.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as far as Louis as a character goes, it's something the movie doesn't really address at all. Chad, you might remember this because I remember in the novel, he talks a lot about his brother, who was, again, very religious, very pious, who died young. I don't remember Louis having the wife and daughter in the book that passed away. I feel like that was just a fabrication for the movie because talking about a priest brother or whatever would take too long and not be as sexy.
Right.
But it does, if you're looking for a motivation, I think Louis does like life. He likes people. And I think he got that respect for life from the religious teachings of his brother, which is kind of complex because he's a plantation owner. But there's also a whole missing sub-story line of a lady who is working or living in another plantation that he visits her almost as a guardian angel and helps her make these decisions about her family when they're trying to keep their business afloat after I think their patriarch dies. He doesn't reveal that he's a vampire, but he sort of visits her as almost a holy presence. That's completely gone from the movie. So you are left to wonder all these things about Louis. The one thing that I can't remember if they addressed this at all was he does go from only wanting to eat rats and crawling creatures to being fine with just going around killing people again, I guess, with Claudia. I don't really know that they made that leap. Why is he fine with it all of a sudden?
Yeah, I don't know that we get that in the movie. But yes, it does seem like he, because she's not going to eat rats. I think was kind of where I was like she's not going to eat rats. So I guess we got to kill some humans here and there.
I guess that line from Pulp Fiction, also 30 this year, where he's like, "Yeah, my wife's a vegetarian," which kind of makes me a vegetarian.
But we haven't talked about the vampire theater, and I feel like that is one of the great set pieces and sequences of this film. I remember watching that in the theater and just being like, "Oh my, this is some racy stuff here." Also, being an actor, I love the idea of them vampires pretending to be humans who are pretending to be vampires and actually murdering people on stage and getting away with it, because they're busy clutching their pearls and going, "Oh my goodness, what effects we're seeing here."
I thought that was one of the eeriest parts because you, as the viewer, know what's happening. It had almost like some Eyes Wide Shut feelings at times. Obviously, them draped over, and then seeing I think what made it so eerie is the crowd even is wondering, is this real or is it not? Or are they just doing a great illusion, great job? I think I'm kind of scared.
Yeah.
So I thought that was probably the creepiest part of the whole movie. They're enjoying the arts. They're enjoying, because if you have like a lavish lifestyle, but you seemingly are really mad all the time and a grumpy asshole, you're not enjoying any of it. I mean, clearly the Antonio Banderas character felt menacing, but he certainly also was involved in something that he could also build upon and enjoy. And I think that's something that vampire plots in general in the modern age can really explore. I mean, during this, I had a lot of thoughts of the boredom could be them just scrolling through their phones, or like it's almost like living alone during COVID. Like, I've watched everything. I can't get a dope hit anymore off of anything. So I thought that was the most interesting aspect plot wise and humanity wise, to be honest. So yeah, I loved all that.
Bobby, how about you?
Oh, I love the vampire theater scenes. They're so fun. They're so imaginative, and even like before they get to that, your introduction to Santiago, how he does that thing where he walks up the wall and is dancing like that is like, I remember being little. It just like caught my imagination. Like, wow, and it's like a really great spot in the film because the movie has a very like, especially with with Louis, you have a very melancholy air, and that just the whole vampire theater sequence is like such a breath of fresh air.
Totally agree with that, Bobby. I mean, we've got, for me, the Tom Cruise character is on another continent. We've suddenly got this very active arts community of vampires. The film really just has a robust second half with that. The scene where the camera is pointing down at the woman, she's been placed on the stage, and it takes a heartbeat. All the vampires are almost waiting for a cue, but as soon as they get it, in the robes that they're wearing, it's just so snake-like. It's a beautiful scene. It's horrifying, but I love the purpose it serves. But that contrast of these are old, decadent, completely unfeeling, uncaring monsters, and then you have this new world, very fresh vampire who's just been turned, who is still has this morality. I remember reading the book, and I was so frustrated as a youth in reading that they had come all this way for answers. They were coming up dry. They were like, maybe we're the only ones. We couldn't get answers from Lestat. We're getting nothing here in the old world. And then all of a sudden, he runs into this vampire. In my mind, I'm thinking, cool, you're all vampires. Like, you can have a vampire tea. Let's talk about everything. And all you get
all blood.
Cream, sugar, I don't know, whatever you take. And it was just so frustrating that the very first vampire they run into is this clown who's in the book, there's a lot more buildup of, he's hearing somebody following him, but it's impossible. He's a vampire. Every time he turns around super fast, nobody's there. And then he starts mimicking him and just being a right ass. And then you find out why, because they just have no interest. They see him as potentially a threat. And then the vampire code, which is their morality laws, they have all of their old world powers that however old they are. We're kind of given hints that different vampires might have different powers, different
dark gifts. Yeah,
exactly. I really like that portion. I think the loss of Claudia it was as close to real emotion as that film takes me. Is Louis' loss, and Claudia feels like she's coming to peace with some things, and then to have this partner, mother figure who's super okay with being a new vampire and then being like drug off immediately for death. But yeah, I love that whole scene.
Yeah, I mean the vampire theater stuff is great. I think it really does come alive on the page. The one improvement I will say the movie made over the novel is in the book, Lestat actually shows up in this portion somehow, and is not quite involved. I think he might be like he knows Armand, and somehow he is the key to them putting like Claudia and Louis on trial for like his being killed. Like he shows up and drops some kind of a hint like, yeah, they're the ones who did this to me, and then he kind of disappears until Louis finds him later. It doesn't make a lot of sense in the book, so I'm glad they excised that. Right, the thing that's the true nightmare sequence is when the vampires come alive, when they're able to go and lynch the two vampires, or I guess three, that broke the code. You get the feeling like there aren't a whole lot of vampires left in the world. The ones that are around are incredibly bored, so they have this like little art theater troupe to give them something to do. But then it's like, wait, we get to kill people in creative ways, like our own people. This is amazing. We've got this self-righteousness. We're just going to take out on these folks. And I love the well that they put, Claudia and her new mother, Madeline, or whatever her name is, in. And there's this sense of, they do it at night, and Claudia kind of passes out from exhaustion, and the moon is still out. And then she wakes up and she sees the pre-dawn sun kind of creeping in, and there's this moment of terror and helplessness. She doesn't try and fly away, or maybe they realize that there's nowhere to go, but they don't really try. They just huddle together and embrace. And then Louis, oh my God, being put in a coffin and then bricked up, just that sense of claustrophobia and realizing that you're going to be in that box for eternity. And I think there's a detail that our Stephen Ray character, I can't remember his name, Santiago mentions. He's like, yeah, you're going to be in there, and it's going to take you several hundred years for you to actually die. So have fun screaming. I think that's the most powerful stuff for me in the movie. The ideas around eternity, eternal boredom, eternal suffering, while still existing on the human plane, but still also realizing that there is a concept of hell and damnation, so that being around here is still better than going there. It's the eternal dilemma.
I love the image of Claudia and Madeline, having been turned to ash. And it wasn't until after a couple of viewings that I went, and I kind of had the same reaction as I do when Kiefer Sutherland as David in Lost Boys, when he turns from a vampire back into his human form, and he loses all his stubble. I'm like, wait, what happened here? The dresses that Claudia and Madeline are wearing, they also turn to ash. And I'm like, I don't know why that would happen. I mean, it's a much better visual, but I think there could have been something kind of great about them wearing these beautiful, colorful dresses and just being, ash underneath. But it was an interesting choice. I was like, hey, wait a minute, that wouldn't work.
I love that idea of seeing the dresses with the ash underneath. Man, yeah. If they ever remake this movie, then
it's like reverse Beetlejuice.
Well, this is actually where I was going to go next, because they have remade it as a TV series. Chad, have you been watching that?
I started last night. The minute looking it up, I remember hearing something about it. Anne Rice was involved. She passed away before it actually began to air. Apparently, she sold the rights, but they still spoke with her. I watched the first episode last night. It is sumptuous. It is
good,
gorgeous, and it actually achieves some truly horror-worthy moments, whether it's a little bit of psychological horror or not for the faint of heart. All the eroticism that was stripped for the early 90s version, it's all going to be there. And these are actors that I don't personally know them to the extent that even in the early 90s, having seen Tom Cruise and everything, it's just very refreshing, and it's amazingly acted, in my opinion. The script is solid. I really recommend it.
Has anybody else seen it?
Yeah, yes, I've been watching it.
Yeah, Bobby, tell us your thoughts on it.
I love it. Our sort of complaints about the film, how sometimes they'll take emotional leaps and things like that. They really go in deep with it, both in terms of sexually and horror, and just in the characters' relationships, the historical aspect. So I've really, really been enjoying it.
Well, and I think you have the opportunity to really explore these characters in depth, and we have hundreds of years that we can, follow Louis. I'm curious, how do they handle Louis and his kind of existential malaise?
Bobby, you're probably farther along than I just watched the first episode, so
they keep some of his family characters are alive in the beginning of the series. So instead of it just all being internal struggle, you see that struggle like externally as well. So you see his conflict with his family members and having his whole life change. It's like less. He's I feel a more proactive character.
What streaming service is this on? Where can I watch this?
I think it's on like AMC Plus.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you know what? I think you're right. I think you're right. Yes.
I do remember seeing
also
that.
The home of Shudder. So you should all have AMC Plus by now anyway. One last little niggle I had was that when Claudia kills Lestat, for somebody who has the ability to read thoughts, he just might have not had his radar turned on at that point. He's the only one who seems to have a dark gift that is, or at least that we go into in the film. And his being the ability to read thoughts. But yeah, you wouldn't think you'd be able to creep up on that guy very easily.
When she first comes around the corner, is very apologetic, and he's at the piano playing. He seems fine, but then within about 30 seconds, all of a sudden he's very haggard, and she says, "Oh, look at your color," which I don't think it's been remastered at all, but he actually looks flushed. So maybe vampires are opposite. When they actually look full of blood, that's when they're unhealthy. And maybe like Bender, where if he hasn't drunk, he's ill. And then within the next 30 seconds after that, he's like barely able to stand.
I got the sense that, and this is just kind of what I read into it, was that, she's been around him so long. And this more comes out in the novel, where Claudia and Louis are plotting to get away from Lestat, and they kind of have disagreements like, what are we going to do? And he's going to find out and all this other stuff. So I would think that with her kind of dark intelligence, she would have a way to kind of cloud her intentions from him. On top of that, she offers him these two like twin boys who are, drunk, passed out. It's kind of like that sexual rush when you get like really excited and all other thoughts kind of go out of your head. Like this, I'm about to make a really bad decision. I don't really care because it's right in front of me. I think those two modes of distraction really kind of open them up.
In the novel, does the process of reading thoughts, is it something that you just do naturally, or you have to think about like, this is what I'm doing right now? Because I could see Lestat being so arrogant that he wouldn't imagine that like Claudia would betray him like that.
Sure.
Like that.
Well, they don't. Chad, correct me if I'm wrong. They don't really get into the whole mind reading thing in the book. The way I feel like that's more a construct of the screenplay.
This actually made me want to reread the first two books. I don't remember well enough. But I will say it does come up in the almost truer to the book series, or at least from the first episode, it feels, yeah, there's been some minor changes, but once again, his brother is a priest. So I feel like they're being within very narrow margins, pretty true to the book, and there is mind reading going on there to a large extent. So
okay.
Maybe it was in the book. I don't remember.
They do make a big deal about being able to smell, except when Claudia has hidden a corpse underneath her dolls. In the novel, there's like this back, almost like a carriage house that is in the back of their, estate or whatever, or estate, that she hides corpses in, and they kind of discover it when they go back there. But this is just like, no, they go into her room and they don't notice the stench from this rotting corpse until she like starts pulling dolls off of it.
That part definitely made me laugh. I'm like,
heavily perfumed dolls. That's all.
How dare you? This uncleanliness.
And again, he's saying, why would you bring this into our house? Like, he just moved right in and assumed like, squatters' rights. This is half my house now.
Well, considering how disappointed he must be, nobody literally turns the way that he wants them to. It's like he keeps picking very poorly. Final thoughts on Interview with the Vampire, and appreciate everybody and their insights. Jess, go ahead and kick things off.
The alligator was great. I had a really hard laugh at the end. I mean, again, because I'm coming into it, 30 years later, I came into it like, I'm just looking to have a good time. I'm like, this isn't Tremors or Anaconda, but it has some moments that give me similar joy. And I was totally cool with that. But the end specifically, I was laughing out loud. I was like, this is so profound. It just felt, it had the sheen of 1994 and like how a Hollywood movie would end. It just, the cruising down the highway and sparks flying off the side of the bridge. It's just so many movies of that time. And overall, I had a really good time watching it. I don't know that it's like in there with like, I'm going to watch this a bunch again, but I'm glad I finally did. And I think in the context of that year that it came out, and also considering Brad Pitt's a year away from Seven, and I think that's where he really opens up as an actor, and then everything after, and then also Tom Cruise, like I said, with Eyes Wide Shut, and then Magnolia, and then whatever. And I've kind of recently had a renaissance where I watched is it Edge of Tomorrow and like a few newer movies where I'm like, I'm enjoying Tom Cruise movies again. My like high school self was like, fuck this guy. And I've come back around and I enjoy it. And I thought he was pretty funny at points in this movie, obviously dancing with the corpse, but also accidentally, like he was so distraught about the corpse hiding under the dolls. I just thought his energy was a bit manic and sometimes uncontrolled in a way that was still funny. And overall, I had a great time watching it.
Cool. Bobby?
I love this movie. It led me to discover Dracula, and in a weird way, I could see why. As I mentioned it earlier, at one point they are wearing tuxedos and capes. They spend a lot of time with the vampire rules, so it has a classical era or a classical aura to it, but it also has that very 90s feel too, like in the ending with the music, and it doesn't make sense how he's gotten so much better so fast, but it's cool, it's not and then too, it has so many great colorful characters.
Ian?
Bobby, you brought up a good point. When and how did Lestat learn how to drive a car? But no, also with the car thing, the year before this, Christian Slater was in another movie, True Romance. Again, another scene where he jumps into a convertible and like slams out into traffic and causes all this chaos to get away.
Helicopter. I forgot about the helicopter.
It's an okay movie. I recommend it, but I really recommend reading the book and then watching the movie just as an exercise and adaptation. Yeah, I'm excited to see more, and I'll check out that the Interview with the Vampire TV series, because now I am officially intrigued.
And Chad?
Despite watching it and just remembering that disappointment that this was the Lestat we got after waiting so long. It's still a wonderful film. Had it not been that cast, it might not have gone anywhere. It might not even gotten greenlit. So I enjoy it for what it is. And I think everybody should go out and, if you haven't seen it at this point, definitely see it now. And then you can compare and contrast if you read the book, if you watch the new series. Just like you said, it's a great trip down memory lane. It's got to be in the top 20 vampire films. And Bobby, like you said, it led you to discover Dracula. There's even a line that I had missed all previous viewings where Lestat is introducing Louis to rats as a form of survival. And he says, yeah, we don't normally do this, but if you happen to get stuck on a boat for a month or so, like, I know some other vampires who had who got stuck on a boat for about a month.
Crossings,
Oh yeah, there's also that bit where he's I don't know if this was in the book, but it's really works in the movie, where Louis is talking about the advance of technology and how it was through the power of film that he was able to see sunrise again. And we get a moment of him watching Nosferatu in the theater. It was kind of fun.
Yes.
Well, and I love the fact that we get Sunrise, the F.W. Murnau, who directed Nosferatu, his film of Sunrise, and then we cut to 1988 where it's Tequila Sunrise, and I'm like, there you go. It was a fun callback. Also, this is just a quick shout out, but Neil Jordan directed one of my favorite werewolf movies, Company of Wolves, which came out in 1984. So 10 years prior to this, he'd gotten some cachet, which is what allowed him to do The Crying Game. And The Crying Game is what allowed him to get to do this film. So he's definitely somebody who has a respect for the genre, and I like he keeps coming around to it and doing interesting things within it. So check out Neil Jordan's filmography and tick off all the horror stuff within.
I just want to say there's a really great sketch on YouTube. It's from the MTV Awards where they do Adam West plays Louis and Frank Gorshin plays the interviewer. And when he goes to bite him, the words like bite, suck, appear on his screen.
That is a perfect way to wrap up. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good night.